This is an episode of Unconfined, a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu. Mike Milley is our sound engineer and produced our theme music. Your hosts are Tom Philpott and Christine Grillo. Paulette Wilson is the producer, and Natalie Woodwright is the executive producer. The opinions expressed here are not necessarily the opinions of the Johns Hopkins University or of the Center for a Livable Future. Welcome to Unconfined, Episode 2, the second part of a three-part series in which we explore biogas. One of our researchers has described biogas as the current fire in the community. The digesters are expensive to build, they don't seem to generate much income, they don't seem to offer real climate solutions, and they pose some pretty significant problems in terms of environmental justice. We don't have a lot of data yet on the environmental harms of biogas. And without that, biogas looks like an economic jackpot. Today, we have policy advisor for the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment, Patty Lovera, here to talk with us and help us understand some of what's going on with biogas. So welcome, Patty. Really glad to have you on with us today. Let's start with the money. So who is really psyched about biogas and who's investing in them?
So the concept of the technology of what is happening in officially they're called anaerobic digesters. That technology's been around for a while. You could argue about which generation we're in, but the concept is if you store a lot of especially liquid manure from a dairy farm where you have a lot of animals concentrated in one place, you're probably no longer moving that manure mechanically, pushing it out, shoveling it out. When you get to bigger, what we would call factory farm operations, you're using, gravity and water. The manure falls into some kind of pit. It's flushed into often a big outdoor lagoon. And the conditions of keeping that manure in, with a lot of liquid, not a lot of oxygen, so we call it anaerobic digestion. There's not oxygen there, is a really great environment for breakdown products, including methane. So there have been attempts over the last several decades to say, what could you do with that methane? If we put a bubble, if we put some kind of cover over that lagoon, we trap the gases, what could we do with those gases? So earlier generations of this technology, it was about what is the machinery to take that methane, burn it, generate electricity. And that generation, the electricity was for use there. Can we run some of the equipment at this dairy or this hog confinement with electricity we're generating here? It's on-farm use. Some of those are still around. They were big in the 90s into the 2000s. There was a lot of push for them, but didn't really pan out economically. They're pretty expensive for an individual operation to build. And I'm getting to the money who's paying part in a minute, but it was sold as like, this is going to reduce your electricity bills. This is a way to close the loop. You have this waste. Let's use this waste to generate power. But it's a lot of machinery. It's pretty complicated machinery. You need to catch the gas with a cover. You need to move the gas some distance, maybe close by to where the digester is and then where the power equipment is. Now we're entering kind of a second or third generation where they couldn't quite get that first generation to take off and economically go. And so we're entering a new generation where it's like, maybe we don't use the gas right there. And maybe there's some economic scale benefit from having bigger collection networks of gas for generating at individual lagoons, and it's more efficient to kind of burn it and generate power, or collect it and turn it into some kind of liquid fuel, compress it, and it can go into buses or, become transportation fuel. So there's this phase we're in is actually even more expensive than the first phase of collect it, digest it, collect it, and do something with it. Now we're also adding an element of often moving it to another location for a more centralized thing. So it's big money. You just
so it wasn't working out on the farm. And so now we made it bigger.
Exactly. Okay. Right. So, some of it is, the technology was fussy, individual farm operators, had trouble keeping it running. You had to be in a place where you were generating that electricity. You might be generating extra electricity, more than you need. And can you put it on the grid and sell it? Is it worth anything? That was very site specific, state specific. And so that generation, there's still some in operation, but it didn't take fire, and just spread the way lots of proponents thought it would. But it did create this idea that this is worthy of government support. This is something that especially federal dollars should be flowing into, because it really has been pitched for many decades as this solution to so many problems that we have, without any analysis of the root cause of those problems, which is keeping too many animals and their manure in one spot, right? So we aren't having that conversation. Instead, we have built this very kind of complex layer cake of subsidies that could, in any given one of these proposals, chime in and this, fill in and provide some funding. And then this next generation is even more expensive because you have just this bigger, more capital intensive model and very dependent on government subsidies. So the short list in general terms is there are several flavors of federal money flowing into this. Some come from Farm Bill programs that are good programs. We want them around. Conservation programs, or if anybody is a Farm Bill follower, we have a conservation title in the Farm Bill, and the government spends a lot of money. It's voluntary. It's not regulation, but it's if your farm wants to do X, there's an array of alphabet soup of programs, and several of them can and do put money into building either the digesters themselves or some of the affiliated infrastructure. So for hardcore Farm Bill nerds, there's a conservation program called the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And there's particular details in there about, we give a preference to livestock. The maximum grant size could be pretty high. And so if you have an overworked set of people deciding how many grants to give out, they might give out fewer but larger grants for things like building a lot of concrete for this kind of manure management. Another Farm Bill program in a different wing of USDA is called the Rural Energy for America program. Again, it's not a regulation, it's voluntary, and again, it's a good program. The folks I hang out with don't hate that program. They just don't want it to be building digesters. It could also be putting a lot of solar onto farms. It could be helping farms update their equipment so they're more energy efficient and they use less energy. There's a lot of good that comes out of REAP, but also we're seeing a big push to use it to build these very expensive digesters. And then the third category is, and this is new in this new generation of, we're going to use it spread out, maybe distributed factory farm sites with a lot of animals. And then we're going to feed the gas into some kind of centralized network and either burn it for electricity or use it as transportation fuel, but do something, move it somewhere and collect it. This generation is really leaning very heavily into renewable energy credits. And so there's different flavors of those. Your state you're located in might have a renewable portfolio standard of, X% of our electricity mix in this state should come from quote unquote renewable sources. And then you get manure qualified as a renewable source. In your state legislature, the California carbon market is driving construction of these facilities around the country. Other state markets will kick in as well. And so there have been deals where the folks are out there saying, here's the case study for our project. This is how we paid for it, where companies have nothing to do with agriculture, put up money, and then because they want to own the credits that will be paid off the gas that is generated. So they are really building this kind of layer cake of sources of money to make this work, because one, they're very expensive, and two, they don't pencil out without a lot of like other sources, usually of public money kicking in.
Right. So it's state by state that it gets qualified as renewable or not.
So there's that piece of you could get in your state program for renewable energy credits, and then California, and then some other states. And there are other folks who are more up to speed on this than I am. I get Food and Water Watch and other places. They're tracking this, but the short version is, California created a market. And so gas that is generated outside California can generate credits in the California market that state set up, and some other states are following in their footsteps. So, but I mean, the California carbon market gets talked about as an explicit driver of the boom that's happening right now.
Right. And so, we have a researcher here who said that we have a lot of sort of international companies investing in these facilities. So what makes it so attractive to them?
That's a great question. I think, there's folks on the ground who probably are asking the same question or might know more. One example, just because of who I hang out with, I hang out with folks in the Midwest and the upper Midwest. They had a batch of proposals from a company called Nature's Energy that I believe started out here. Actually, I think they were European, but then they got acquired by Shell. So you're talking a whole different level, of big multinational, and they run facilities in Europe. So, there are digesters. Like, this technology is fairly common and getting more common, it seems like, especially in the EU. And then it becomes a question of scale. Are they doing it just on manure, or are they doing it on a mix of other things? You could add things to the manure like food waste or crop residues, but it also becomes an issue of scale. Are they doing it on facilities that have 10,000 cows in one place? So they have figured out some of the technology. They have clearly figured out the market there for credits and payments, et cetera. And they see the U.S. as an opportunity to go bigger.
So do we have a reasonably good idea that they're a profitable operation in Europe, that they've figured out something there to make it work and generate income and be a net gain?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I'm the best one to answer it, but the number of companies and the number of facilities, and they aren't all a year old, indicates that they have figured something out, but it does not appear to be purely market-based there either. There are the same dynamics of renewable energy definitions, credits, subsidies, et cetera. And it also is a very different electricity market, so it's not an apples to apples comparison about like if they just do it here the way they do it there, because they have a different energy sector and things like that. But there is absolutely, it's not happening just that's self-financed and self-funded. The subsidies and the credits are a piece of the story there too.
Right. So just to back up for a minute, just to be really clear for the audience, that there's the idea of them being market-based, where they're turning a profit on their own. And then there's the idea that, like here, there's a lot of subsidies propping them up, and that they're not really market-based profitable here.
Depends, I think it's in the eye of the beholder and what they think the market is. So folks I hang out with, I don't think so. These are not like, I run this facility, I want to add this piece to the puzzle of how I run this factory farm. I'm going to go to the bank, I'm going to get a loan, I'm going to finance it, and I have a plan for how it pays me back. It is much more complicated, the income streams and the financing. And at the scale that this current generation of digesters seems to require, it would be shocking for it to be self-financed by anybody. So that doesn't meet the definition of what kind of, the small family farmers I hang out with think of as a functional, actual market-based versus like taking this government money. And, this is not unique to this sector. There is a lot of public money in our agriculture system. I don't have a problem with that concept. I have a problem when you break down where does the money go, for what purpose, and for whose benefit, and is it being done in an equitable way? So, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy has done some great analysis of that one program, EQIP, right? The Environmental Quality Incentives Program. It is a popular program. In Farm Bill speak, we say it's oversubscribed, and most people don't get a grant, but manure management can.
So you talked about the Farm Bill programs, REAP and EQIP, that are two of the programs that are sort of propping up this industry. Does the Inflation Reduction Act, does that support the biogas industry in any way?
Yes. So the Inflation Reduction Act was this massive, historic infusion of money into existing programs. It didn't make new programs. That was the whole maneuvering that had to happen in Congress to do it that way. They use a special procedure and they dump a ton of money into stuff that already exists. So these were programs we already had. Several of them were conservation programs like we talked about from the Farm Bill. So EQIP, REAP, these are programs that existed. They've existed for several decades now with little tweaks, and just huge amounts of money have shown up in those accounts that have to be spent. And so there were some tweaks, which actually we were happy about, particularly in EQIP, that dialed back the bias towards manure management a little bit, but not enough. And when you have that much money to spend, and a fairly urgent sense that it needs to be spent and you need to get it out the door, and you have an enormous amount of hype, and there's no other word for it, coming from USDA and EPA that digesters fix a multitude of problems. There's just tremendous momentum to give that money to things like digesters.
And it's so easy because the money just shows up and you don't have to make anything new.
They're not writing new, they are, but in the scope of, they're not standing up a new program. They're using an existing program and funneling the money through it. And that existing program had a pretty significant tilt towards funding these kinds of programs. So we've seen a little bit of the results so far. They're doing things in batches, and a recent batch of announcements about that REAP, the Rural Energy for America program. There were digesters on the list getting grants and loans. It's harder to know in EQIP just because the way they report it is super frustrating. But manure management at large operations is something that in some parts of the country really does get paid for. And the frustration with that is there is tremendous demand for these programs, especially from smaller farms who get turned away. So even with this infusion of money, if you still have all this momentum towards these big ticket, very expensive, factory farm practices, there's some states where 75% of applicants get turned down to these programs, many of them small. So we could spend that money we could get more bang for the buck, and it would be a hell of a lot more equitable to spread it around amongst smaller operations as opposed to keep doing these big ticket, very capital intensive programs like biogas.
So you used the word hype a minute ago. So where is all the hype coming from? Like, who made the hype? Where did it come from?
Oh, it's just tremendous. We could do a 3-day podcast about thinking that leads to the hype. It is not new. It has been going on for a while. I don't know when it started, but it was a long time ago. So there's an official federal program to promote anaerobic digestion. It is not neutral. It is not like, if you're thinking about it, here's what to know. It's like, you should do this. This technology should be broader. It's called AgStar, AG. STAR is a joint effort. It's a collaboration between the EPA and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I describe it as hype. It is not neutral. It is like, we should build some of these. Here's how. They promote that you can get federal money to do it. They proudly track how many we've built and how many we might build. Secretary Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, he's kind of if you're like me and you're tracking what's going on in agriculture policy, I'm fairly familiar with his stump speech. And, he thinks that manure is another source of value for farms. There's a lot of talk of we're wasting this potential of this manure. How do we make it value add for operations? And there's a lot of rhetoric about closing the loop, capturing the value of these waste products. And in an academic abstract level, yeah, I'm all for closing loops. I want to capture value. I want more income streams for farmers. But missing entirely from the decades of hype around this technology is, because there's a lot of talk about, well, we have this methane problem. We don't know what to do with all this manure. What do we do? What do we do? We're not talking about why are we putting so much manure in one place in a lagoon-based liquid management system. We're not talking root causes, and root causes are factory farms, consolidation, concentration in one place. The manure, from 100 small dairies is a different scenario than the manure from one mega dairy. And you don't need digesters in the small dairy scenario. And there's a long list of other benefits from that system. That doesn't get talked about. What gets talked about is this win-win-win situation of putting a digester on the lagoon, because we kind of lack the imagination at policymaking levels to say we could raise animals a different way.
Right. So, there's a lot of evidence out there about how the digesters are not great for communities, not healthy for the people who live near them, and also just backing up to why do we have so much manure in one place, how that kind of model of livestock production is not great. So I guess one of my questions is, do you think Vilsack and his compatriots believe the hype?
Yeah, I do actually. I think, that this for those who've been following along, this is not our first go round with Secretary Vilsack. He did the job before. These kinds of conversations, there's little kind of narrative points you kind of see evolve over the years, but I don't think there's outright, I have friends who do think, but I don't necessarily know if there's outright hostility towards the scenario of, 100 small dairy farms, but there's just a lot of fatalism about, too bad those guys can't survive. It's just too bad that those small guys, their time has passed. And this is what we do. We do big, right? And there's been a lot of really wrong thinking for a lot of decades. That it's inevitable, it's more efficient, it's advantageous, and maybe we can carve out that this is what it is, and we lack not even a possibility, let alone lacking the will to do the work to get to a different system, and the best we can do is maybe make a niche for those little guys to do, direct market sales, local foods, that cute stuff over here. But this is the system we have, and we have to make it work. And these are the problems in the system we're stuck with. So if digesters solve that problem, there's a lot of that just kind of inertia. And on the flip side of it, there's a lot of that inertia on the energy side. So if you build this network of digesters to take this gas and put it in to a gas-based system, but it's renewable natural gas instead of fossil natural gas, you are sticking in a gas-based system that burns gas, whether it's in a bus or in a electricity generating scenario. You are not investing in real renewable energy, right, of solar or wind or something else. We're doubling down on gas drives our energy system. We're just going to make the gas more renewable because we said it's more renewable.
Right. And in terms of, what problems biogas solves, I think it's pretty clear that we don't think it solves too many problems. Right. But how has it gotten such a good reputation for being a climate solution? How did that happen?
It's a question of, I think it's a question of whose problems are you solving, right? And it's not the neighbors across the road who have to still live with this giant lagoon full of manure that yet now it has a tarp over it that catches the gas, but the smells still get out. It can still leak. The rap sheet of accidents is growing as we see more facilities. You're not down to zero. It doesn't magically poof make the manure go away. So there's still stuff at the end. The technical term is digestate. There's still solid materials that have to be dealt with at the end of the process. And in most scenarios, they're being land applied just like manure was. And there can be significant amounts of it. And we aren't doing a good job of thinking about what does that mean for water quality if you're putting that on land, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not really solving the problems for those neighbors, but if you're a big industrial scale factory dairy in the Central Valley of California, and California starts to map hot spots that are you can see them, defined hotspots of sources of methane, and it lights up with dots on dairy lagoons, then digesters might solve that problem, right? If you're the one who's feeling pain from that because California started to hone in on methane as part of their climate strategy. So you just aren't looking at everybody else that might have problems from this model too. To their credit, California does have a program. It's just much smaller. To talk about alternative manure management, is there a way to get out of the liquid manure lagoon system and onto, some kind of pasture-based system? That's a heavier lift. It's a bigger transition. They did acknowledge the concept in their climate program, but we need a lot more of that, and it needs to be on equal or bigger footing than just spend a lot of money on one of these digesters and capture the gas and keep the system and just build something to deal with the gas.
So when you were talking about how these digesters still create solids that need to be moved somewhere, handled some way, it got me thinking, okay, so what are the rules around this? Are there rules? Who gets to open up who gets to build a digester, and who gets to veto that? And then who checks to make sure that everything is being done really beautifully and in all fairness to all community members?
Well, that is the, billion-dollar question at this point. And there may be examples where there are well-regulated, people are happy, we see enforcement and compliance, et cetera. But we have a lot more examples in the circles I travel in of the answer in many states is we're not sure yet. But sure, we'll consider your proposal. So, like I've been mentioning, there's, you're building a digester to generate electricity for your farm. You're building a digester that captures the gas, and you have to build pipelines that go somewhere to a bigger pipeline to get to the spot where they're going to burn the gas. We have yet another model where you move the manure to a central facility. So that's really looking more like an industrial site. The model is garbage incineration. Like you just got a lot of trucks bringing the fuel for this centralized facility to do something with. So is that an industrial site? Is it an agricultural zoning? Is it a solid waste permit? Is it a water permit? Is it an air permit? Is it all of those? And states are still figuring that out.
One thing I'm wondering is, I think I know the answer to this, unfortunately, but as biodigesters and biogas continues to be popular and sort of the renewable energy darling, is that going to mean more industrial farms?
That is a very savvy question that I think the industry doesn't want to talk about. I think, sadly, it does, or maybe not. Maybe existing farms get bigger, large operations become massive because this is their new revenue source that makes it work. So we're just starting to see rumblings of this, in trade publications, dairy trade publications. There's one that was like, so is the gas going to be worth more than the milk? We can get there. We can see how that would happen. There's a agricultural economist in California that dared to say that. And, I don't even think it was a published paper. I think it was kind of like a policy blog of like, it's not that many steps to get to the point where if the credits hold up, if the market for gas stays what it is, you could reach a scenario where the main economic driver of this facility is that we're generating renewable natural gas, not an agricultural commodity for sale. And then the other little point we all have in the back of our heads, is probably, 5 or 6 years ago at this point. Smithfield went very big publicly with a pledge about, we have a climate goal, and the way we're going to reach it is with digesters. They were very clear about that. It was it's well before the pandemics, but I don't know what year, probably 6 years ago. And they said, for the places we run in North Carolina, we got a lot of, hog operations. We're going to put a digester on there, and we're going to work with, at that point, it was, I think, Dominion Energy and Duke Energy, and we're going to figure out how to sell the gas. And then kind of at the bottom of the press release, they were like, and we might build new ones in Utah. And we're going to put that gas capacity in from the start. This is not about retrofitting. We think this is the new model. So, I actually don't know. It's not clear because many things have happened since to that company's structure. But they saw that as a viable option at one point, that you might want new facilities built with this gas market in mind. And so it really does lead to that kind of questioning about, is it changing the economic incentives of this business? And if you are a small dairy producer in a market where milk prices don't have to be that great because the big operations get a carbon credit check and you don't, because you're not in a digester, can you stay in business just selling milk? If the market shifts, that the agricultural product doesn't have to pay for itself because you have these other sources of income making up the difference. If you are shut out or can't get into those other sources of income, you might be out of luck.
Right. And then, will milk become a byproduct of?
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah. In a conversation of people who are, kind of on the ground thinking about livestock production and who can be in it, or folks who are living next to these facilities, you get to that point pretty quickly. It is not that abstract to see how that could happen.
Wow. All right. So I'm just going to ask one more thing, which is, we've been talking here a little bit about how land grant universities have played into this industry. Is that something that you're able to talk about?
Literally, like any other issue in agriculture, the land grants are probably, if there is hype, from the government and from the industry, it is a very safe bet that there's hype coming from the land grants. So whether it's an agricultural economist saying, this is how you do it, and whether it's extension going out and saying, you want to build one of these, here's how you go get the money. Here, this is how you apply. These are technical systems. This is not a do-it-yourself situation. There's a lot of engineering involved, and there is advice about the right way to set up your lagoons and to build this and to construct it. And some of that advice is going to start, if it's not already, I have seen some things, it's going to be coming out of kind of like the agricultural engineering advice generation places, and those are land grant universities. So there's usually not a lot of daylight between what kind of the biggest players in the industry want and the advice that's coming out of land grants. It is not shocking to learn that as the federal government has invested less in agricultural research, corporations have invested more, and it shows in the outcome.
So not rave reviews for for biogas, not really a climate solution. Maybe it solves some hot spots in California, some specific hotspot problems where the facilities are digesting from big dairy CAFOs, but not really a reliable source of too much energy, not a reliable climate solution. And definitely it doesn't sound like they're going to be able to support themselves without subsidies. So, do you have anything that you would like to say about policies and economics of biogas that we haven't covered here?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you with that summary, right? It's not going to pay for itself. You're very dependent on the whims of renewable energy credit markets, and they're going to be radically different in a year than they are from today. Those are changing all the time, and there's a lot of politics as well as policy involved in that. It really, it depends on the price of gas and natural gas that you're competing with. So, just because it doesn't pay for itself, I'm okay with the government investing in our energy system to make a transition. I'm okay with our government investing in our agriculture system to make a transition. But if you are going to spend, as a scientific term, a boatload of money, then make a bigger change than this. So this is going to require tremendous amounts of money from different levels of government and private money. And if you're going to spend that kind of money, how about we get off a system based on burning gas, right? How about we get off of a system where we're confining tens of thousands of animals in one place, where the list of, negative effects of that is as long as your arm, and transition people to a system of raising animals in a much more land-based way that avoids these problems. And you hear a lot of well, that would take a lot of money. So does this. And once you spend this money, it is much, 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 we're sinking more money in a failed system, the factory farm system, and a gas combustion-based energy system. So let's stop throwing money down that hole. If we're going to spend a bunch of money, we could make bigger, much more meaningful changes that have a list of benefits that's a mile long, including methane reduction. But instead, because there are players who can keep doing what they're doing in agriculture and energy, and then there's some other players they're hanging with who can make money building this stuff, this is the silver bullet that a lot of people are clinging to. And it's a little bit heartbreaking to see this level of money go into such a tiny step in the scheme of what we need to do.
Yeah, but we love silver bullets.
No, exactly. This is really becoming kind of like a very classic example of very reductionist silver bullet thinking, missing the systems analysis. But if you live across the street from a hog confinement in North Carolina that really has reached the end of its useful life in terms of whether any of the, safety systems have ever worked, whether they're working now, and the odors and the flies, and they're still going to have solids they apply to land. What does this investment do for you? Not a damn thing, right? But it props that system up and it makes it harder to shut that facility down because they just spent $500,000 to put that digester there. So it really, it's not only is it a waste and is a missed opportunity if you are living with the consequences of these factory farm operations, it's locking us in to that mistake.
I mean, the more money you throw into it, the harder it is to back off.
Get out. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, this was Patty Lovera. She's a policy advisor for the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment, and was very generous today to spend some time talking with us about the biogas industry and digesters. And again, thank you for your time and take care.
Great.
This is an episode of Unconfined, a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu.